be looking at worship for the next 4 Sundays. If you have a Bible or Bible app, you can find Exodus chapter 3, and then you may also find Exodus chapter 34. If you use the YouVersion app, you can go to events, find GCF, the event for the day, which are all the verses listed there for you. If I were to ask you, where is the largest worship facility in the state of Kentucky? Some of you might say that was probably Southland Christian Church, just up the road here. I think this is actually the picture of their worship center from their Richmond Road campus, but we're familiar with that building up at the top. When I first came here 20 years ago, we all called Southland Fort God. When we were, not to be mean, it just was the style of the building. And so you might guess, it's pretty large, the second largest church in the state of Kentucky, but not the largest worship center. You might guess that the largest worship center in the state of Kentucky is Southeast Christian, which is in Louisville. If you're driving on 64 into Louisville, you'll see this big, humongous complex over on your right. If you've never gotten off the highway here, you should get off the highway and go drive around it. And just it's even bigger when you get around it. And you can see the size of the worship center there. Southeast regularly qualifies as one of the top 5 largest churches in the country, 30 to 35,000 members over there. But I don't think that's the largest worship center in the state of Kentucky. I think this is the largest worship center in the state of Kentucky. Rupp Arena. And it's filled up to 23,500 people going nuts about Coach Cal's Wildcats. And we go nuts when we go there. Some of us who can't go there watching on television, we go nuts at watching it because there are just certain things that we know about the Wildcats. We know that Coach Cal will typically have one of the best recruiting classes in the entire country. If not the best, it will be one of the best. We know that Coach Cal is one of the best coaches in the country. Not the best, I don't think, but he's one of the best in the country. We know when we go to see a game or we watch it on television that because it's the Wildcats, we know that there is a much higher likelihood that we are going to win than we're going to lose. And that is why that when we win, we typically act like when we lose, we typically act like babies. Right? Did we lose this thing again? Yeah. There, we'll try this one and see if anything's cutting in on it. So we know that, as I said, we know we're going to win more than we lose. We know that we've got over 70 years of winning history behind the Wildcats, and there's a tradition to uphold. And so when people show up there and it gets filled up, we can call that worship. Now, for some of you, it's going to be uncomfortable to call what happens in Rupp Arena worship. But I think it's more than adequate to call what happens there worship, because this is just a basic way to think about worship. The word worship, the way we use it now, comes from the Old English word worthship. And when you use worship as a noun, it means you're saying something is worthy. For example, the Brits would often refer to their kings and queens as your worship, to indicate that they were very, very worthy people. But when you use this word as a verb, which is the way most of us tend to use it, it means that you are declaring the worth of someone else, or you're declaring the worth of something else. And guys, I would say by that basic definition, that's exactly what happens in Rupp Arena. 23,500 people, thousands more watching their televisions who are intensely declaring the worth of Coach Cal and the Wildcats. It is worship, even though it makes us a little bit uncomfortable to think about that like worship. Now, if it makes you uncomfortable to think about what happens in Rupp Arena as worship, you really need to ask, you don't need to ask, is it right to call what happens in Rupp Arena worship? You really need to ask a different question. And the question you need to ask is, if what happens in Rupp Arena can be called worship, why is what happens in Rupp Arena so different than what happens in these places we call worship facilities every weekend when we gather in them? Why is there an intensity in a place like Rupp Arena that we often don't experience or sense when we come together in places like this? And I think if we were to ask that question of Moses, like Moses back in the Old Testament, I think Moses would say to us that the difference is in what you know, or the difference is in who you know. Because I think Moses would tell us worship comes from what you know or who you know and how well you know it. Because it's very, very difficult to worship something or to declare the worth of something if you don't know what that something is or what that someone is. Why would you bother to declare its worth if you didn't have some familiarity with it? Now, we like to be the kind of church here, really strive to be the kind of church here where those of you who were in church all your life, you obviously know who Moses is. But we try to be a place where maybe you've not been in church for a long time and you just popped in here this Sunday for the first time. You may not know who Moses is. I just want to say, it's okay not to know who Moses is. And I'm going to fix that right now. Moses was born thousands of years ago in a 400-year period where the children of Israel, the Israelites, were in slavery in the nation of Egypt. And Moses only lived by a sheer stroke of something stunningly miraculous, because the Pharaoh ordered that the firstborn sons of all the families had to be put to death. And Moses was saved because his mother took him and hid him in a basket in the bulrushes of the Nile River. Now, by another stroke of the miraculous, Moses was found by a member of the Pharaoh's family and ended up being adopted into the Pharaoh's family and becoming a member of the Egyptian royal family, basically raised after he was weaned in the Pharaoh's household. Fast forward several years when Moses is a young man, we discover that Moses, though he was raised in Pharaoh's household, knows that he's an Israelite. He knows what his ethnicity is. Because he's out one day and he sees an Egyptian slave master beating an Israelite slave. And in a fit of rage, Moses murders the slave owner because he identifies himself as an Israelite. There ends up being a death warrant put out for Moses by the Pharaoh. He has to flee from Egypt, and he goes out to this place called Midian, which is on the far east side of the Sinai Peninsula. Sinai is that triangle bit of land that exists between Israel and Egypt, still to this day called Sinai. And he flees out there, and out there he meets this woman named Zipporah. She has a dad named Jethro. She has a lot of sisters too, but Moses meets Zipporah, falls in love with Zipporah, gets married, is taken into Jethro's household, and Moses sets up life as a shepherd out in the wilderness of Midian, in the wilderness of Sinai. You have to think about how drastically different that is from what Moses was living like. He was a member of the Egyptian royal family, living in the palaces of Egypt, and all of a sudden he is now a shepherd living as far away as he possibly thought he could get from the Israelite children in slavery and from the death warrant that was sworn out for his life. And it seems when you read the story that Moses was actually quite content being a shepherd. Just being far away from the royal family, far away from the Israelites, far away from the death warrant, a totally contented life Moses has out in the wilderness. And one day, he's tending the flocks near a place called Horeb Mountain, what would also be called Mount Sinai. And he's around the base of the mountain, and somewhere up on the mountain, he sees this very specific thing. In Sunday school, you probably learned that Moses saw a bush that was on fire but not burning. Which is not quite accurate, because the text of Exodus actually tells us that he saw an angel in the flames of the bush that was flaming up but not burning up. And Moses just kind of gently thinks, that's cool, I'll go see what it is. Like, seriously, read the text. That's kind of how he responds. Well, that's interesting. I'll go find out what that is. And as he gets near the burning bush, he hears a voice calling his name. The voice says, Moses, Moses. Now, Moses quite likely recognized that as a divine voice. But what divine voice? It's important to remember that Moses was an Israelite by ethnicity, but not necessarily by faith. He was not raised in the traditions of the Israelite faith. He had been raised in the traditions of the faiths and the various gods of the Egyptian royal household. And so when Moses hears this divine voice, he doesn't really have a relationship with this divinity that's calling him. And so Moses needs to know, who is this God that's calling out his name? And it's obvious that God knows that Moses doesn't know who he is, because God goes to the trouble of introducing himself to Moses. He says this, I am the God of your father, The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Yes, Moses, there are lots of gods you've worshipped back in Egypt. But the one who's talking to you right now, by the way, I'm the only one. The one who's talking to you right now is the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. You remember all those stories, Moses, that you may have heard when you were little, before you had been weaned, about how I called Abraham and moved in the lives of Isaac. And I even did some stuff, a lot of great stuff in the life of that pesky little brat Jacob, and did some amazing things. This is who's talking to you. And then God lowers the boom on Moses, because God says to Moses, I have big plans. I have heard my people in Egypt. I've heard the cries of their oppression. I've seen what the Egyptians are doing to them, and I'm going to rescue them. And guess what, Moses? You're going to be the one who goes back to say, let my people go. And Moses must have been thinking, wait a minute, there's a death warrant out for me back there. And God says, but you're going to be at the centerpiece of this plan to get my people out of Egypt. And Moses has some objections to this. He asks several questions to try to find out why God would choose him, really to try to insinuate to God that God, hey, you've got a bad idea. It isn't really about being the father of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but not necessarily the father of Moses. This is a bad idea. And it's the second one of those questions that I really want us to think about this morning as we think in the context of worship. Because here's the second question, sort of objection that Moses asks, and it's a hypothetical. It's a hypothetical question for God. Well, God, suppose I go to the Israelites down in Egypt and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask, what's his name? What shall I tell them? I don't know if they would have asked Moses what the name of God is. I kind of suspect Moses is asking this for a much more personal reason. I think Moses wants to know the name of God who's told him to go do this thing. It's like, if I'm going to even think about going to do this crazy thing, you need to tell me your name. I need to know who you are. And I think his motivations are much more personal here. It's just throw the people of Israel under the bus in this circumstance. I need to know who you are before I go and do this. And the amazing thing, guys, is God tells him what his name is. Like, God gives Moses a name. He says this, I am who I am. That's the name. That is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. It's like God is saying, I am who I am is my name, but for short you can call me I am. Just for short, you can call me I am. Now this is an interesting name, so that you kind of know how it flows into English. In the Hebrew, it's the name I am. The Germans, unfortunately, when they were pulling this out of Hebrew, changed it to the word Jehovah. That's a really, really bad way to say this because there is no J in Hebrew. But the Germans love J's. So there's a J there. They said Jehovah. But the most likely way to say this name is actually the name Yahweh. Whenever you have sung a worship song that has the name Yahweh in it, you have been singing God's personal name. Now, we can't be sure that Yahweh is how you pronounce it because the Israelites decided because of the commandment that said you shouldn't take the Lord's name in vain that they would never say it. So it's written in Scripture, but they would never say it. So in your Old Testament, when you see Lord, capital L-O-R-D, you know the word that's there in your Bible is Yahweh. And what they would say when they would read it is Adonai, which I find kind of strange because right after God gives them his name, he says, hey, this is the name you're to call me from generation to generation forever. It's the name I want you to use. It says it in verse 15. So he says, I am is my name. And this is a really significant name. This name tells Moses so much about who God is. It tells him so many things about who God is. So he asks God for a name, and in return God gives him a name, but God gives Moses his name, and a name that discloses so much about who God is as a person. You know, if I tell you my name is Jason, which in the Greek means something like healer, you don't know what it means in the Greek. So before you know who Jason is, you have to actually know some things about me. When God gives his name, he immediately gives a name that discloses to Moses significant things about who he is. So one of the first things this name probably disclosed to Moses, this name I am, is that God is the source of all being. It's an all-encompassing thing to say. I am. Period. I just am. And God is in essence saying to Moses, he's a bit like a bicycle wheel. If you take the hub and the spokes out of a bicycle wheel, you don't have a wheel left. It will collapse. And God is by this name sort of saying to Moses, that's the way I work with all of creation. All that you can see, all that you can touch, all that you can taste, this is how it works. It's there because I am there. It exists because I exist. You take me out of the picture, it doesn't exist. That rock. Rocks are not living things. But God is in essence saying, the rock is because I am. And he's saying, if I am not, the rock is not. Saying the same thing about a tree. That is a living being. The tree is because I am. Take me out of the picture. If I am not, the tree is not. And the same thing for you and I. You are because God is. And if you take God out of the picture, you are not. That's just basically how that works. He is the source of all being. Everything that exists gains its existence from Him in such a way that if He stopped existing, nothing that exists would continue to exist. It would all just stop. Later on in the decades, after Jesus was died and rose from the dead, Paul, this church planter and pastors, a mad evangelist planting churches all over the Roman Empire, leading people to Jesus. And he lands in the city of Athens in Greece, which was one of the intellectual capitals of the ancient world. And Moses ends up this place called the Areopagus, where he's talking to a lot of these really brilliant people. And Paul, Paul doing what Paul always does, trying to lead people to Jesus. That's just what he did. Like he woke up in the morning, it's like what he was thinking about doing, I think. He's got to lead some people to Jesus. And so he's in the Areopagus, and he wants to lead them to Jesus, and he's trying to use things from their own religious traditions to convince them to see who Jesus is. And one of the things Paul sort of insinuates to them is this. He says, look, no matter what your religious tradition is, everybody tends to believe that everything that exists somehow comes from one God. If not from one God, it somehow seems to flow from, you might call it, one great spirit. He's like, everybody believes that. Like, there weren't a lot of atheists back in the day, necessarily. By the way, atheists actually believe things, too. It's like, this is just kind of general. This is what everybody believes, that everything that exists has come from one being somehow. Right? And so then Paul puts it this way to them. He says that the God in whom everything finds its existence, that's the God of Israel. It's the God of Jesus. He puts it this way. For in Him we live and move and have our being. So what Paul is saying, if you exist, if anything exists, it exists only because it finds its source of being in God. And if you remove God, if God somehow disappeared, you wouldn't exist. Nothing would exist. God is the source of all being. That name, I am, tells Moses that. Now that's interesting because this name, I am, also has a fill-in-the-blank quality. Right? It's like, I am blank. And this is important because that's sort of insinuating to Moses that God can be whatever He chooses to be. Whatever He desires to be, He can be. God can fill in that blank after I am, however He wants to fill in that blank. Whatever He chooses to be, He can be. Nothing is stopping Him from being whatever He chooses. And it's interesting, if you look at this passage in Exodus 3, this exchange between the Father, between I am and Moses, it's interesting just in that passage how God fills in the blank. So, for example, He said to Moses, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. It's like God is saying to Moses, I could have chosen any people, but I am choosing your people. I am your God. Then in another place, God says this to Moses, I am concerned about their suffering. God's like, I could have filled in the blank with, I am not caring. But instead He said, I am concerned. That's who He chose to be about their suffering. He said to Moses, I am sending you to Pharaoh. Moses probably thought, I wish you'd send somebody else. But he could have chosen everybody else. He could have chosen anybody else. But what He's saying to Moses is, I am choosing you to send. See how God can fill in the blank however He wants to fill it in. Then a slight change in the verb form. But He says, so I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians. God could have been, I am leaving them stuck right where they are, but instead he says, I am coming down, I am rescuing them. He fills in the blank however he wants to. I am can choose to be whoever he wants to be. The interesting thing about this is that in a later exchange with Moses, I am Yahweh, who has basically established that he can be whatever he wants to be, tells Moses, but there are always certain things I choose to be. I can be anything I want to be, but there are always certain things I'm choosing to be. There's a consistency to the way I'm choosing to be whoever I can be, whatever I want to be. By the way, that name, I am, that who I am, can also be translated as I will be what I will be. It's God's freedom to choose. But then he says to Moses, but I'm sort of intentionally restricting how I choose. And this happens later on after all the plagues have been delivered against the Egyptians and the people have been walked through the waters of the Red Sea have been parted and they're all the way through there. And they get to the other side, they build the golden calf while Moses is getting the 10 Commandments and they're all naughty, like really, really naughty. And, Moses goes back up to the mountain so God can, so God can sort all this out with God. And while he's up on the mountain, this is so great. Moses he's gotten bolder as he's gotten older. You ever notice how that happens? People get bolder as they get older. And Moses has definitely gotten bolder because the guy who asked God, what's your name, is now not satisfied just to know a name. And he says, hey God, I'd like to see you. I don't just want your name. I want to see your presence. And God is like, that may not be a good idea. Because God knows that he is so holy and so glorious that full exposure to his being, like Moses, might not exist anymore. And so God says, here's the deal. I'm going to come to you, but all you're going to see is my backside. How about that? God's going to show you his backside. That's what you but all I'm going to show you is my backside. And so God, we don't know if this was a pre-New Testament appearance of Jesus or what, but God in some form or fashion appears to Moses, and all Moses sees is the back of God passing by. But right as God passes by Moses, God uses his personal name, and he goes on a riff with Moses, and he says, I am the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. Here's what he's saying. He says, I am filling in the blank. I can fill in the blank however I choose to fill in the blank. But Moses, here's how I typically fill in the blank. It's how I actually consistently fill in the blank. I am compassionate. I am just. Two things that human beings can never figure out how to get together. God gets together. It says, I can choose to be whoever I want to be, but I am consistently always choosing to be I am compassionate. And I am just. And it's really interesting because Jesus picks this up. Jesus picks up these I am statements. Jesus, the Son of God, who has come so that people no longer just see God's backside, but they see God in his fullness, face to face in Jesus. And Jesus picks up this I am, this personal name of God. He applies it to himself, and he fills in the blanks. But he fills in the blanks in ways that are totally consistent with the way Yahweh, God the Father, had filled in the blanks in the Old Testament. He says, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. You guys, when God gave Moses his name and walked by Moses and said, I am compassionate, I am just, here's how Moses responded. Moses bowed down to the ground and worshipped. We're going to see in just a few weeks how these are the two primary actions of all worship in Scripture. The primary actions involved in all scriptural worship are bowing down and worshiping, which means calling out vocally, singing, declaring. The two core actions of all worship. And that's what Moses did. And Moses did it because he knew who God was. He worshiped because he knew knew God was the source of all being. He worshiped because he knew that God could choose to be whoever he wanted to be, but God, he knew, consistently always chose to be compassionate and just. And because of what he knew, he worshiped. And the same thing is true of us. We know God even more fully than Moses did. We know Jesus, who also said, I am these things. I am compassionate and I am just. And so the natural response for us ought to be the same as it was for Moses. We worship Jesus. We worship God because we know who's up. It's not just a mystery out there. It's not just something hidden from us. We know who's up, and that's why we worship. We know who's up. We know he is worthy, and because we know he is worthy, we worship him. We worship him because we know who's up. I didn't know until last week that there is a professional ultimate frisbee league in the United States. I never thought there would be such a thing. But there's an ultimate frisbee. It's called the American Ultimate Disc League, because if you're a serious frisbee golfer, it's insulting to call it a frisbee. It's a disc, right? And I learned that their latest franchise has been opened up in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And the name of their newest franchise it's called the Minnesota Wind Chill. It gets pretty cold up there. And there was a sports writer for the New York Times who was writing about this, and he said, isn't it interesting? His name's Victor Mathers. He says, isn't it interesting that back in the day when a team chose its name, it usually chose its name because of one of the better qualities of the city it was located in. So there's been a trend recently for teams to name themselves out of something that would make you never want to move to the city that the team is in. And so he mentioned just a few. I'll share just a few with you. There's an Ultimate Disc League team in New York that's called the New York Gridlock. He noted that in Miami, and this is so true, that there's no team in Miami called the Miami Sunshine or the Miami Gorgeous Beach. Instead, you have the Miami Heat and the Miami Hurricanes. And go up the coast just a ways, and you have the Florida Gators. He made note that in addition to this, there are the San Jose Earthquakes, there are the Colorado Avalanche, and the Iowa State Cyclones. My favorite was the soccer team in Chicago, which is called the Chicago Fire, which is named after a tragedy that burned half the city and killed 300 people. His favorite was a minor league baseball team in Savannah called the Savannah Sandbats. And one of the things he found amusing about this is that a brochure for the city of Savannah actually describes these little sandbats and says this about them. Quote, they leave awful little bites where they rip back the skin to drink your blood. Savannah Sandbats. Now these names, these team names, even though they don't mention pleasant things about the cities they're in, these names are intended to communicate something incredibly important. These names are chosen because they are intended to communicate to the opposing team and their fans that when you come to our city or we come to your city, you better take us seriously. Because if you're playing disc against us, we're going to put the chill on you. You come to Miami, you're going to feel the heat. You go up to Upper Florida, you're going to get bitten by the gators, right? You go to New York, we'll get you stuck in gridlock. It's intended to communicate that the other team should have a certain type of response where they take seriously the person or the people they're going to be facing when they go head to head. And guys, it's the same thing with the name of God. When he says, my name is I am who I am, or just I am, that name communicates to us things about God that really also say to us, you ought to take me seriously. You ought to really, really think about who I am when you want to do this thing called worship. And so, guys, you know who's up. And because we know who's up, we know he's worthy, and therefore we ought to worship him. Now, this presents a problem to us. Because it's been my experience personally and as a pastor that we usually don't come to worship with a firm idea about who's up. We usually come to worship wanting God to deal with how we feel. So I often come to worship hoping that the Lord will have a word for me. Sometimes we come to worship hoping that Ranjo's chosen worship songs that we really will like singing. Sometimes we come hoping that the sermon doesn't go too long, or that there's just some little nugget in it that will really just transform who we are as a person when we leave here. That if we came in feeling bad, we'll just feel great and ready to conquer the world when we leave. And none of that is necessarily bad. The darkest thing about that is if you come into worship thinking about how you feel and how you want God to change how you feel, you'll typically leave the same way you felt when you come in. Because the way worship accomplishes the transformation we're often looking for is not by staying focused on ourselves, it's by staying focused on the one that we know, and we know who's up. So that when we come in this place, it's not about how I feel, whether I feel crappy or whether I feel like $1,000,000. Because I know who's up, I worship. I worship whether I feel like it or not. I worship because I know who's up, and I know he's worthy. And so just to kind of help everybody remember that this week, on the back of your weekly, there's 3 little sentences in red. If you'll take that out, there should be a pen on the seat next to you, because it's going to be really good if you fill in these blanks. Because how I want to just end this first week of this series and to kind of kick us into preparation for the next 3 weeks, there's 3 statements here I want you to rehearse this week. Some of you listen to worship music in your car. Some of you may have quiet times. I don't know. But it just, whenever you find time this week, I want you to rehearse this statement, because I think the right place for us to begin is readjusting a basic way that we think about what we do when we come together here. Because we need to adjust away from it being about me to it being about who it really is. So here's how you're going to fill in those blanks. The first one is, worship is not about how I feel. That one is so important, I'm going to say it again. And you might need to circle the not. Worship is not about how I feel. Worship is about who I know.
Amen.
Thanks, Oriel. Worship is about who I know. And then here's the final one. And I know who's up. We're going to put all 3 together. And I don't usually make you do this, but I'm going to have you do this. I would like you to take about 20 seconds and turn to someone next to you, just to tag team, and I want you to say this to each other. And then when you're done, you can pat each other on the back or high five. Go for it. All right, guys, so here's the thing. Next Sunday, there's a picnic coming, I promise. Next Sunday, when you wake up, you're like, oh, I can just stay in bed. Oh, I've got this problem. Oh, I've got that problem. You can just say out loud, worship is not about how I feel. Worship is about who I know, and I know who's up. So let's stand together and ask the worship team to come on back up. And I want to be aware of an important reality. And that is that many of us in this room can say, I know who's up. But there are very likely people in this room who know that even if they said it, they don't really know. And I'm just going to ask everybody, just right now, everybody in there, just close your eyes, because if you were in that place, you could be like, yeah, that's just not really true of me. For lots and lots and lots of reasons, I just don't know who's up. Like you guys have talked a good game about God this morning. But maybe you're just saying something, I really don't know. And I don't just mean no ideas, but you know that you don't know God in terms of relationship and friendship. And if that's where you are, you don't have to open your mouth to do this. I just want to guide you in a quick prayer. And the first thing, you just pray something along the lines of, Jesus, I want to know you. Then if you pray something like this, I know, Jesus, that I can't know you unless you make it so. I can't know you, Jesus, unless you make it so. And so, Jesus, I'm asking you to come in the power of your Spirit to know me so that I may know you. Just as we get ready to close out here, at our Elder Council retreat now, a couple of weekends ago, one of the images that came up in that retreat was an estuary. If you don't know what an estuary is, because most of us had to look it up when the word came up. An estuary is a place where the fresh water of a river meets the salt water of the sea. It just so happens that estuaries are some of the most vibrant, biologically alive places on Earth. And as I've been thinking about that and praying into that image over the last 2 weeks, one of the things I've definitely sensed is that as a faith family, we are to be an estuary like that. We are to be a place where the sort of the fresh waters of God meet the salty waters we've been in. The salty water we may be in so that new life can come out of that. And I think that's true of our whole faith family, but I have not been able to get away from sensing the Lord saying, but Jason, that is especially true for one place. I'm going to make it true for one unique place, and it's this place. I've had such a deep, deep sense of that. But the Lord is saying the place where the fresh water of my kingdom will meet the salt water of the culture in people's lives is in this place. And I put that out there because I think there will be some of you here this morning, and some of us every week, who've been pickling in the salt water. And we need refreshing. And that's what this is for. That's what this place is for. And so in some ways, it's always going to confront all of us, not just those who don't know Jesus, but all of us, those who've been following him for a long time, to gauge almost every week, how salty am I? And do I need fresh water? Because it's here. It's here. And the power of the Spirit is bubbling up. And that may be for numerous things. Over the last few weeks, we've had 2 people healed of knee pain. And one of them who was healed of knee pain while being prayed for went out in the Spirit. That sounds scary, but it's one of the most lovely places in life to be. We've had 2 people over the last few weeks who have been healed of deeply, deeply emotional stuff that they didn't think could be healed. They didn't think they could be a new person in light of those things. It may be something like that that's there for you this morning. It may be something physical like the knees. It may be an ingrown toenail. Whatever it is, this is a place where the fresh water of the kingdom meets the stuff that's going on in our lives to bring about new life. And so I'm just going to ask you, this is always terribly risky for me. We're going to be obedient to the Lord. We're just going to take a minute, and I'm going to ask the Holy Spirit to come as we do. If you just need the fresh water of the kingdom in regard to something in your life, I'm just going to ask you to come and just stand down here. We're going to pray for you in just a few minutes. So come, Holy Spirit, come. Come, Holy Spirit. start singing, come and be praying for them. You can, if they don't want to share with you what the prayer need is, you just go ahead and pray. If they do want to share it, you can pray into that. We're going to worship as we do. You are welcome to stay in worship and keep singing as we enter into a time of prayer. If you haven't come yet, you're more than welcome to go ahead and come. I don't want anybody to leave here with salt water. So let the Lord pour it out. We're going to sing. We'll ask that since we have people praying and some will still be worshiping, if you could hold a conversation quietly to the back of the room or even outside, and kind of respect the space here for worship. So let's sing together. And if some of you